Joe Tucker, and I'm president of the International Academy of Trial Lawyers. And I'd like to welcome you to The Rule of Law, The Academy Speaks, the official podcast of the International Academy of Trial Lawyers. Today, I have the great pleasure of having one of my role models, idols, good friends, and colleagues, Dicky Grigg, speaking to us today. Dicky's also a former president of the International Academy of Trial Lawyers, and I'm glad to stand in the same shoes that Dicky once stood in. Today, we're going to be talking about something that I didn't think we'd ever really talk about, and that's due process and what is due to citizens of the United States as well as non-citizens of the United States. And Dicky, you have a great background on this because from about 2006 to 2010, you represented detainees who were in Guantanamo Bay. Could you tell us how it is that you came to represent these individuals, Dicky?
Yes, Joe. I was at an academy meeting and they asked for volunteers to represent detainees in Guantanamo. And I volunteered and ended up representing three detainees that were taken from their homes in Afghanistan and taken to Guantanamo Bay. And as you and I have talked about, there are so many things that happened with detainees that are unfortunately happening again today.
Well, before we bring that to today, let's talk about what was going on during that time period in the '06 time period when you were representing these detainees and what you were trying to accomplish for them and what you ultimately accomplished for them.
After 9/11, the Congress of the United States gave President Bush almost unlimited powers to punish those who had caused 9/11. And we invaded Afghanistan shortly thereafter. Well, the Geneva Convention, which we signed and which we expected others to follow, and which our military had always followed, said in combat, if you capture a prisoner, as soon as practical in the field, you need to have a hearing to determine the status. Is he a prisoner of war? Is he a spy? Is he an innocent civilian? What is his status? Well, our military, General Franks, if you may remember, was leading our invasion of Afghanistan, started setting up these hearings. But the executive branch, and in this case, the Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld, with the president's approval, said, no, we're not going to follow the Geneva Convention. We're not going to follow the rule of law. And he had the military to start flying the men they captured to Guantanamo. And basically, this was sort of like we're seeing today. The executive branch chose not to follow the rule of law.
Now, what happened because they weren't following the rule of law with these detainees?
Well, what happened, I mean, why they weren't following it is one, they didn't want to treat them as prisoners of war. And they wanted to basically use torture in trying to obtain information from them, both which violated the rule of law, in this case, the Geneva Convention. And so the president took the position that, just like today, he had the power to determine the status of the detainees, that he had the right to hold them indefinitely, and that detainees had no right to due process. They could not have a hearing and they could not have an attorney, similar to what the executive branch is saying today about, for example, immigrants.
Now, at the end of the day, what were you able to accomplish for these detainees that you represented?
At the end of the day, we were able to file habeas corpus petitions for them, and the majority of them, out of 500 all, but maybe 20 or 30 were released and allowed to go home. And just sort of like we're seeing today in Guantanamo, we saw lawyers at their best, and unfortunately, we saw lawyers at their worst.
Tell our listeners a little bit about that.
All right. As far as lawyers at the worst, just like we're seeing, today, Uh, the executive branch got the Department of Justice. They said, all right, here's the bottom line we want. You figure out how we can do it, how we can basically not give these men due process. The same thing they're doing today. And lawyers did that. They came up with very spurious reasons and arguments on why detainees were not entitled to due process. But on the other side, lawyers at their best, out of the 50 largest firms in the United States, and by that I mean international firms, conservative firms that were representing big industry, international firms, 37 in some way represented detainees, either individually or pro bono arguing before courts for them. And basically, something I found out immediately is that due process, the rule of law, is not a partisan issue. It's not a Democrat or Republican issue, a big firm, a small firm issue, a conservative or a liberal issue. It mattered to lawyers everywhere to defend the rule of law, and those lawyers did.
And Dicky, even in Guantanamo, there were some heroes in the federal government who said the rule of law means more to me than winning this case. Tell me about those 8 prosecutors in Guantanamo Bay and what they gave up.
There were 8 of the prosecutors at Guantanamo Bay that they were military officers, and the military asked them to prosecute detainees under these military tribunals. Well, they refused for ethical reasons. They said that it is unethical for me to prosecute someone using evidence obtained by torture. It is unethical for me to prosecute somebody when you don't turn exculpatory evidence over to the defendants. And I know all lawyers, Joe, I have lost some money because we felt something was unethical. And we've lost clients because we thought what the client wanted to do was unethical. But these men and women lost their careers when they refused to prosecute detainees under these military tribunals. Their career was over. They never advanced again in the military, yet they stood up for what they believe. And that is lawyers at their.
That's what courage looks like. That is real courage, and we appreciate them for doing that. Dicky, as it relates to Guantanamo Bay and the United States being at the top of the rule of law, and it stands for the rule of law, and we've spread that throughout the world, our democratic partners. What happens when the United States is not consistent with the rule of law?
Guantanamo is an example. It really hurt America's moral authority abroad. Uh, and you've traveled, with the academy and all these countries that follow the English common law, England, India, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, all of those countries, and I've talked to lawyers in those countries as you have, they always used and cited American cases, Brown versus the Board of Education. Uh, America was sort of a moral beacon from it. After Guantanamo, uh, America lost a lot of moral authority. Uh, it hurt us with our allies because they had trouble with their people, their public to support us. And then it also hurt us with our enemies because Guantanamo became a poster child for terrorists everywhere that wanted to harm the United States. And so anytime we don't follow the rule of law, it really hurts America.
Well, let's juxtapose that with what's going on today, with what's happening with the federal government arresting people on the streets, at their homes, at jobs, on college campuses, and shuttling them off to places without hearings. And talk to me a little bit about that and what's going on today.
It's very similar to what they were doing in Guantanamo. Uh, they were classifying people. Uh, the executive branch, not the courts. They were not giving them a fair hearing. They were not giving them due process. And that's what we're seeing today. And we're also seeing the Department of Justice today, making arguments like, well, we didn't turn the plane around because it wasn't our plane. It was the military plane. Or, it wasn't Homeland Security's plane. It was, the Army's plane. Just arguments that are totally invalid and totally ridiculous to try to support what the executive wants to do. And this was the same thing that was happening at Guantanamo. They were bringing these men over, and out of the first bunch, Joe, out of 520, it ended up only like 21 had been captured on the battlefield. And when they finally were able to have fair, impartial hearings, it turned out most of them were just turned over to the CIA for money and should never have been captured at all.
We use this term, and you and I have an appreciation for what it means. But what does due process mean? How can you explain that to our non-lawyer listeners here?
If the government, in the situation we're talking about, is going to imprison you or try to hold you, that you have a right to a fair and impartial hearing to determine, does the government have a factual and legal basis to hold you or to require you to do anything? And what happened in Guantanamo is sort of what we see happening here with, for example, with immigrants or the immigrants from Venezuela or whatever. It's usually minority people, and the government knows that the general public is not going to be upset if.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you about. Why should I care about some Venezuelans who are being sent back to Venezuela who, at least according to the administration, are members of gangs?
Unfortunately, the average man on the street doesn't, because he doesn't identify with a Muslim detainee from Afghanistan that was in Guantanamo, or somebody's here, even though the law has said legally you can stay here until you have an asylum hearing from Venezuela or Mexico. And it is important because if those people don't have the right to due process, it is very insidious and can, keep increasing until you or I don't have a process. Because what it's going to stop, if the administration, the executive branch, they get to make the determination. And we're seeing it to some extent today. If you disagree with the president, law firms that disagree with him or people that disagree with him, they're trying to deport you, or they're filing things against, law firms that have done work that he disagrees with. Well, what's going to stop him from coming for you or me if we disagree with him? And that's something that, unfortunately, many people on the street, the average American, does not understand.
I'm glad you're bringing that home, Dicky, to the listeners, that it's easy not to relate to the Venezuelan refugee who's here, but when it starts coming home, then it may be too late. And on my original podcast, President Cliff, talked about that exact point, that when eggs are $20 a pound or $20 a dozen and cabbage is $65 for a head of cabbage, it's too late then. So what should we be doing right now to, one, educate people, and two, to fight against this lack of due process that is happening to these people?
I think Cliff Edwards was 100% right that the average person, until it starts hurting them and generally financially, is not going to appreciate what's going on. And that's why it's so important for lawyers to stand up for due process for the least of the people in our society, and stand up for them right now and to fight for due process, to fight for the rule of law. And I think that's basically what we've got to do until, uh, the public generally are there's, I guess you could say, a mass movement among the public that, hey, this isn't right, it's going to stop. But until that day comes, and we don't want it to come too late, uh, the lawyers are the ones that are going to have to stand up for it. And, we're seeing that today in some law firms that the president, has tried to punish, have stood up and courageously fought back. And so far, the courts are going with them. Other law firms, unfortunately, have folded and yielded to the president. And you and I both know that with a bully, the more you give in and the more you yield, the worse it's going to be.
Without question. Back when I want lawyers to understand this, when you were doing the work for the Guantanamo detainees, were you being paid for this?
No, the government didn't pay for you to come fight them. So no, it was all pro bono. And the lawyers that, no matter whether they were arguing before courts, arguing before the Supreme Court, or actually going down to Guantanamo and working with detainees, none of them were paid. And it's a real tribute to lawyers and law firms that they did this work, which was necessary, and they did it for free.
And what's the significance then to lawyers who are listening of us doing pro bono work?
Well, obviously, like in immigration, and I'm representing some immigration clients right now, trying to keep them from being deported. Well, they can't afford to have a lawyer. And so lawyers doing pro bono, and they do it in the academy. It's incredible how many lawyers do pro bono work. Whether it's just to represent somebody on an eviction case or somebody that's charged with a crime that can't afford a lawyer. And that's what's so critical about the rule of law and in America is that everybody, no matter how rich you are or poor you are, you're entitled to a lawyer and you're entitled to due process and you're entitled to, a hearing before a fair and impartial court.
Dickie, you're a couple of years older than me. I think I can, without fear of contradiction, I think I can say that. What motivated you to start representing people pro bono and doing this type of work, such that you are not just a legend in the academy, but a legend across America and champion these types of rights? What got you started?
Well, originally, what got me started at that academy meeting, uh, I was unhappy with what the Bush administration at that time was doing and was griping about it at cocktail parties and all. And when they mentioned they needed volunteers, it just sort of came to me that, this is a chance to put my money or my talent, if you will, where my mouth is, and to really try to do something instead of just sitting there and complaining. And now I keep doing it because I really need some things that'll look good on my obituary.
Well, I don't think you have to worry about that, Dickie. You've done lots of good things for that will be on your obituary, and we hope not to read that anytime soon.
I'm with you. Uh,
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was going to say one other thing, and maybe you were going to ask me about this, but how important the courts are. And in Guantanamo, it went up to the Supreme Court, and the government, the executive branch, was taking the position that these detainees, did not have right to due process or to complain about the manner in which they were being held. And the Supreme Court, uh, in a case called Rasul, held on a 6-3 decision that yes, the detainees have a right to contest uh, the government holding them prisoner, to contest the legal and factual basis the government is using to hold them. And what I think is really important about that decision, it was a 6-3 decision. Four of the judges in the majority that voted yes, these men have the right to habeas corpus to contest their hearing, their detention. Four of the six were Republicans appointed by Republican presidents. And I think that is so meaningful that it's not a Democrat versus Republican. And it's so unfortunate now. Every time a judge makes a decision, it seems they say, well, he was appointed by Obama. He was appointed by President Clinton. He was appointed by Reagan or whatever. Where when that decision was made, 4 of the 6 were Republicans.
Well, let's take it to today's Supreme Court, where they recently held that due process was required for the detainees, and that cut across appointees, whether they were appointed by Bush, Obama, or Clinton. So that I think is important too, and that they talked about due process. So the courts have been holding up thus far.
No, I agree 100%. And I think, that it's going to get more and more important because I believe the administration, is going to test the courts. But I do think that the judges, whether they're a strict constructionist or whatever, realize the importance of the rule of law and the due process, and that nobody in America, no matter how rich you are, no matter if you're the president of the United States, rule of law applies to you.
And I think that's the point that I'm happy to see with our courts, regardless of who appointed them. The judges seem to say, we're going to die on the hill of due process, and we're going to die on the hill of the rule of law. And that's been happening in the district court, the appellate court, and now even in the U.S. Supreme Court, regardless of how they may feel about other issues. I think it's important that they have they have stated the rule of law will apply, and the executive branch has to follow through on the rule of law. The concern has been now, though, Dicky, and I hadn't planned to go here with you. What happens when the executive branch doesn't follow an order by the Supreme Court, which has been a concern raised by some people?
Well, if that happens, then I think we have a constitutional crisis. And I can't think of anything more serious for our country, for our democracy, than having a constitutional crisis because the courts really have no power to enforce their decisions. I mean, even the marshals that work for the courts, uh, they're in the Justice Department. They're under the executive branch. But just like when the executive branch refused to turn those planes around, there's nothing that 9 judges can do to stop that. There's nothing 9 judges can actually physically do to prevent uh, the president from deporting these people. Uh, the country is based on, and our democracy is based on the courts making decisions and those being followed by the public, that the public has the will to follow that. Because I have, and I know you have too, many times lost the case and disagreed with the judge's decision, but you abided by it. And that's what makes the rule of law something that's practical and living, not just a piece of paper. And if that happens, I think that it's going to be a real crisis for our country.
Well, Dickie, I usually end on a hopeful note, but I want to end on that serious note that you've just given us about what would happen if the administration does not follow court orders. And if you enjoyed this podcast, you can find it on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Joe Tucker, president of the International Academy of Trial Lawyers, and thank you for listening to The Rule of Law, The Academy Speaks. I'll see you next week.